The night Clara Ashford walked out of Greywood Hall, she carried nothing except a letter that was not addressed to her, and a truth that would bring down the most feared duke in the northern counties. She did not run, she did not cry, she walked. The gravel path from the servants' entrance cut through the east garden, past the rose beds that Clara had replanted with her own hands 3 summers ago, past the stone bench where she used to sit in the early mornings before the house woke up, a cup of tea balanced on her knee and a book open in her lap, past the old oak that leaned at an angle over the path and dropped its leaves every October in a way that made the whole ground smell of earth and cold, and something almost peaceful, past every quiet ordinary corner of a life that had been slowly, deliberately, and very carefully taken from her piece by piece. And yet not once had she complained. Not once had she asked for anything back. The fog was thick that night, a heavy November fog that had rolled in from the valley just after 7 in the evening and had not moved since. It pressed against the hedgerows and swallowed the lamp posts one by one until each flame became nothing more than a soft smear of amber in the grey. The path beneath her boots was damp, and the cold had worked its way through her coat and settled in her shoulders. She did not hurry. She had learned a long time ago that hurrying was the enemy of clarity, and tonight she needed every piece of her mind working in the same direction. Behind her, the tall windows of Greywood Hall blazed with warm light. She could still hear the music from where she walked, a quartet playing something bright and effortless that drifted out across the grounds and dissolved into the fog without caring where it landed. Duke Edmund Harrow's winter gathering was well underway, 200 guests, the finest wine in the county. Crystal glasses and polished shoes and laughter that never quite reached its own edges, and at the Duke's right hand, laughing with her head tilted just so at exactly the angle that caught the light in the most flattering way possible, was Lady Sylvia Crane. Clara had stood at the drawing-room threshold for exactly 4 seconds. She had counted. Not to measure her pain, but because counting was what she did when she needed to stay inside her own mind and not lose herself to the moment. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not because she was hurt. She had been hurt before. She knew the shape of that wound by now, with a precision that would have impressed a physician. She knew exactly where it sat in her chest, a low, dull pressure just to the left of centre. And she knew how long it took to go quiet if she did not feed it. She had stopped feeding it a long time ago. What she had felt standing at that threshold was not hurt. It was something colder and more useful. Something that arrived not as pain but as decision. The kind of decision that does not announce itself. The kind that simply arrives, fully formed. The way a door swings open when you finally push it correctly. She turned around. She walked through the corridor. Past the portrait of Edmund's grandfather, past the arrangement of dried flowers that Mrs. Graves replaced every 3rd week without fail, past the small table near the staircase where the post was always left in the mornings. She walked to the study. She crossed the room in the dark without needing a candle, because she had been in this room 300 times, and she knew the distance from the door to the desk the way she knew her own heartbeat. She opened the 3rd drawer on the left. She found the letter, and then she walked out of Greywood Hall, and she did not look back. Not once. Not even at the oak tree. What nobody at that party understood, what Edmund himself had never thought seriously enough about to even begin to understand, was that the woman he had spent 2 years dismissing and correcting and walking past in his own corridors without fully seeing, had spent those same 2 years paying very close attention to everything, to every conversation that happened in rooms she was not supposed to be part of, to every document that crossed her path, to every person in that house who was overlooked in the same way she was overlooked, which meant they spoke freely in front of her, to the one letter that, in the right hands, would expose everything that Sylvia Crane and her father had been building in the dark for the past 8 months. Clara Ashford was not loud. She was not dramatic. She did not raise her voice, did not throw things, did not deliver speeches in doorways. She was not the kind of woman who made scenes. She was the kind of woman who waited until she had everything she needed. And tonight, for the first time in 2 years, she finally did. Stay with me, because this is not a story about a woman who was broken. This is a story about a woman who was underestimated. And there is a very important difference between those two things. The broken ones never come back. The underestimated ones are simply waiting for the right moment. And Clara Ashford's moment had arrived. 2 years before that night, Clara Ashford had arrived at Greywood Hall on a cold Tuesday morning in October with one trunk, a leather bag containing her father's medical instruments and a small brown journal with a dark green cover that she had been writing in since she was 17 years old. She was 26. She had trained under her father, Dr. William Ashford, a country doctor who had practiced in the village of Renwick for 31 years before his heart began to fail him. She had been at his side since she was old enough to understand what he was doing, and by the time she was 19 she was writing the case notes. By 22 she was managing the patient schedule. By 24 she was conducting the consultations herself, while her father sat in the corner, pounds of the room, and watched with the particular quiet pride of a man who has given everything he knows to someone and can see that it has landed correctly, when his health declined and the county medical board absorbed the practice. The question of what Clara would do next was not a comfortable one. She had no formal medical degree because women in her county were not admitted to the medical college. She had 7 years of practical experience that surpassed most graduates she had ever encountered, and a mind that her father described in the privacy of his journals, which she found later, as the most naturally diagnostic he had ever observed in 50 years of medicine. None of that was paperwork. None of that was transferable in any official sense. The position at Greywood Hall was arranged through Mr. Holt, the county registrar. He had known Clara since she was 12 years old, and had watched her grow up in that village practice, and he understood, in the careful way that decent men understand things they cannot say directly, that what he was doing when he wrote that recommendation letter was not finding her a job. He was finding her a foothold. She arrived at Greywood Hall not expecting very much. She had read enough about Duke Edmund Harrow in the county reports she had processed with her father to understand that he was the kind of man who ran his estate with military precision and expected everyone around him to function at the same level. She expected efficiency, she expected detachment, she expected to do her work quietly and be left to it. She certainly did not expect the grief. Edmund Harrow was 34 years old when Clara first met him. He was tall and dark-eyed, and moved with the controlled economy of someone who had long since stopped wasting energy on anything that was not directly useful. He had a reputation that preceded him through 3 counties, and that reputation contained 2 contradictory elements that nobody ever seemed to think was strange. First, that he was extraordinarily intelligent. Second, that he was extraordinarily cold. Clara had found, in her experience, that these 2 things usually went together in men who had lost something they did not know how to talk about. Grief turned sideways in a man who could not afford to feel it, tended to come out as precision, as control, as a very particular, a kind of ruthlessness that was not cruelty so much as the systematic removal of anything that might cause further pain. She did not know about Thomas yet on the day she arrived. She learned about him 3 weeks later from Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper. They were walking through the old West Wing together, Mrs. Graves showing her where the medical stores were kept, when they passed a small portrait at the end of a corridor that Clara had not noticed before. A young man, perhaps 20, with Edmund's dark eyes and something in his expression that was softer than Edmund had ever managed. Mrs. Graves slowed without stopping. She said, quietly, that was Master Thomas. She said he had died 6 years ago. She said it was a fever. She said the physicians had not caught it in time. Then she walked on. Clara stood in front of that portrait for a moment. She looked at those dark eyes. She thought about a fever that the physicians had not caught in time. Then she went back to her quarters and opened the brown journal and wrote 3 lines. She did not know yet why those 3 lines mattered. She only knew that they did. What Clara was doing in those first weeks at Greywood was the same thing she had always done when she arrived somewhere new. She observed. She catalogued. She built the picture slowly and did not hurry it. She catalogued the medical supplies in the quarters that had been assigned to her, and found them adequate but not organised in any logical system. So she reorganised them, labelling everything clearly, and arranging the shelves by use category rather than alphabet, because that was how a working physician's mind moved. She learned which members of staff had recurring complaints, and which ones were stoic about things they should not be stoic about. And she began visiting the quarters, not on a schedule but at irregular intervals, the way her father had done, because irregular visits caught things that scheduled ones missed. She drew a chart on the wall of her workroom. It mapped the illness patterns of the estate's staff over the previous 3 winters, extracted from the thin records the previous physician had kept, cross-referenced against the seasonal weather logs in the estate diary. The chart took her 4 evenings to complete. When she stepped back and looked at it, she could see immediately that the cluster of respiratory illness every January was not random. It correlated precisely with the ventilation pattern in the servants' quarters, where a blocked return duct was creating a damp, stagnant air pocket that sat directly above the sleeping area. She reported this to Mrs. Graves. She said it in plain language, not medical language, because she had learned from her father that plain language was always more useful than technical language when you needed someone to actually do something. Mrs. Graves arranged for the duct to be cleared and the window fastenings adjusted. By the following February, the January illness cluster did not appear. While Clara was doing all of this, Edmund was conducting his own affairs with the particular focused energy of a man who had a great deal to manage and very little tolerance for anything that slowed him down. He was in meetings with county officials 3 days out of every 7, extending the estate's land holdings westward through a series of negotiations that required more patience than Clara would have credited him with if she had not been watching carefully. He was building a financial arrangement with Lord Reginald Crane, whose estates bordered Greywood to the south, and that arrangement on the surface looked like a simple land cooperative, a shared approach to the management of the valley's water rights. But Clara, who processed the household accounts as part of her administrative duties, and therefore saw the inward and outward flows of money, clarity that most people in the house did not, had noticed that the figures did not quite add up in the direction they should. There was money moving toward Crane that was not accounted for in any land or water agreement she could find a record of. Not a large amount. Not a conspicuous amount. Just a consistent, patient, monthly movement that had been happening for at least 14 months. She noted it. She said nothing. She waited. She was also watching Sylvia. Lady Sylvia Crane had been visiting Greywood Hall since before Clara arrived, according to Mrs. Graves, who said it carefully and without editorialising in the way of a woman who has decided that her job is to observe and report, not to judge. Sylvia came twice a month on average, sometimes more. She was 28, the same age as Clara, pounds, and she was beautiful in the deliberate, effortful way of someone who understood beauty as a professional skill and practised it accordingly. She was clever. Clara did not underestimate that. But the cleverness was aimed at a very specific target, the management of impression. Sylvia Crane was exceptional at appearing to be whatever a room needed her to be. What she was less skilled at, and this was the thing Clara had noticed within 3 encounters, was the moment after the performance ended. The brief, unguarded instant when the audience had looked away and Sylvia's face did the thing that faces do, when they forget they are being watched. Clara had seen that face twice. Both times what she had seen there was not warmth, it was calculation. She wrote it in the journal. She waited. The first real conversation Clara had with Edmund happened on a Wednesday afternoon 6 weeks after she arrived. He came into the medical room without knocking. She had expected him not to knock. It was consistent with everything she had observed about how he moved through his own house. As if the const of a room belonging to someone other than himself was one he had not fully incorporated. He came in, and he stopped. He stood in the doorway, and he looked at the room. He looked at the rows of labelled bottles, all facing the same direction. He looked at the fresh linen on the examination table, folded precisely. He looked at the chart on the wall, which was by this point considerably more detailed than when she had started it, with colour-coded markers and a notation system along the left edge that would have taken a moment to decipher, even for someone familiar with such pounds things. He looked at the chart for a long time. Then he said, without turning around, that the previous physician had never done anything like that. Clara said the previous physician had been very competent in acute situations. She said that pattern-based prevention was a different discipline. It required time to build and patience to trust, and that most employers were not interested in paying for either. Edmund turned around then. He looked at her directly. Not the way he looked at household staff, which was with a kind of efficient acknowledgement that registered their presence, without lingering on it. This was different, slower. The way a man looks at something he has underestimated and is in the process of revising his pound position on. He asked her who had taught her that approach. She said her father had started it. She said she had developed it further, because the evidence consistently showed that it worked. She said that 3 members of the estate staff who had been ill every winter for the previous 3 years, according to the records, had not been ill once this season because of a change she had made to the ventilation arrangement in the servants' quarters in October. Edmund said nothing for a moment. He looked at the chart again. His expression was the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic on something and does not want to show that the answer has surprised him. Then he left without saying anything further. Clara looked at the door after he had gone. She picked up her pen. She made a note in the margin of the chart. She wrote the words "first crack." She did not know yet how deep the crack went, but she had learned from her father that cracks were always worth noting. They were almost always the place where the light eventually came in. The elderly groundskeeper's name was Mr. Arthur Peel. He had worked the Greywood grounds for 41 years, and he had the slow, solid quality of a man who has spent decades outdoors in all weathers, and has made his peace with every one of them. He was 67 years old, and he was short of breath on the stairs. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone who was not paying close attention would notice. But Clara had noticed it on her second day, watching him climb the 3 steps from the kitchen garden to the upper terrace, and she had filed it away. She began finding reasons to be in the grounds when Mr. Peel was working. She did not make it obvious. She simply appeared, asked him things about the rose beds or the state of the east path, and while they talked, she listened to the quality of his breathing and watched the colour in his face and noted the way he moved. By the end of the 3rd week, she was fairly certain what she was looking at. By the end of the 5th week, she was certain. By the 6th week, she had developed a management plan and had a direct conversation with Mr. Peel about it, sitting on the stone bench by the old oak on a grey afternoon while he told her, in the blunt, unembarrassed way of a man of his generation, that he had known something was wrong for about a year and had not mentioned it because he did not want to be put out to pasture. Clara told him, with equal directness, that if he followed the plan she had written out, he was not going to be put anywhere. She told him she had adjusted the medications and the diet, and had arranged with Mrs. Graves to reduce the heaviest of his physical duties without it being obvious to anyone else. She told him she expected him to tell her honestly if anything changed. He said, looking at the rose beds, that nobody had talked to him that straight in a very long time. She said it was a habit. He said it was a good one. What Mr. Peel told Clara over the following weeks, in the slow, comfortable way of a man who has nothing left to prove, and therefore nothing left to hide, was that Edmund Harrow had come to check on him twice in the past month. Not in the manner of an employer inspecting a member of staff. in the manner of someone who wanted to know if a particular thing was working, without wanting to be seen wanting to know. He had come in the early morning both times, before the household was fully awake, and he had asked Mr. Peel 2 or 3 questions about how he was feeling, and then walked away without waiting to see if his interest had been noticed. Clara wrote this down. Then she looked at what she had written. Then she looked at the 3 lines she had written about Thomas 6 weeks ago. Then she looked at the portrait she had passed on the way to the linen room that morning, the one of Edmund at perhaps 22, before whatever had happened to him had happened. The picture was assembling itself, and what she was beginning to see, underneath everything this man performed for the world, was a person who had not forgiven himself for something he could not have prevented. A man who had been present at a death that better medical attention might have altered, and who had been carrying that fact silently ever since, and who had perhaps hired her, not entirely consciously, because something in her approach had looked like the thing that had not been there when Thomas needed it. Clara held that understanding very carefully. She did not use it. Not yet. It was not a tool. It was simply a truth. And she treated it the way she treated all important truths, with patience and with respect, and with the understanding that the right moment to bring something fragile into the light is never the moment when you first find it. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon in the second autumn of Clara's time at Greywood. A private courier delivered it to the estate just after 3 o'clock, sealed in heavy cream paper with the mark of the county legal office stamped in dark blue wax. It was addressed in formal type to Edmund Harrow, Duke of Greywood, and beneath the name were 2 words, "Eyes only." Clara was the only person in the study when it arrived. Edmund had gone out to the western fields after lunch to inspect the drainage work that had been ongoing for 6 weeks. Mrs. Graves was supervising the kitchen staff through a complicated preparation for the following week's household pounds inventory. The footman who received the letter from the courier carried it directly to the study, placed it on the centre of the desk, told Clara it had come sealed and direct, and that the courier had asked for no receipt and left. Clara looked at the letter. She looked at it for a long moment. She was not in the habit of reading correspondence addressed to other people. She had strong views about this, views that she had held since she was a girl, and that had not loosened as she grew older. Privacy was something she respected in the same automatic way she respected a patient's right to know the truth of their own condition. It was not a rule she applied selectively. She placed the letter to the right of the desk, where Edmund would see it immediately when he returned. And she went back to the supply inventory she had been working through when the footman came in. She had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the voice. It came through the half-open door of the study, from the direction of the entrance hall. Sylvia Crane had arrived, apparently unannounced, which was something she did with a frequency that Clara had long since stopped finding surprising. Her voice was distinctive. It was warm on the surface and carried well, the voice of a woman who had never had to raise it to be heard, because she had learned how to weight her poundwards so that people leaned toward them. She was speaking to the footman in that particular tone she used when she wanted something and was packaging pounds, the wanting as casual conversation. She was asking whether a letter had come. She was asking whether it had been opened. She was asking, with a very specific kind of urgency that was slightly too controlled to pass as casual, whether Edmund had seen it yet. Clara sat very still. She looked at the letter on the desk. She looked at the door. She put down her pen. She stood up. She crossed the room. She picked up the letter. She looked at it for one more moment, at the formal address, at the sealed wax, at the words "Eyes only." Then she opened it. What she read in the following 4 minutes was not what she had expected. She had expected some form of legal correspondence relating to the land arrangements with Lord Crane, perhaps a complication with the water rights negotiation, perhaps a boundary dispute of the kind that came up regularly in estate management. She had not expected this. The letter was a formal notice. It informed the recipient that a proceeding had been initiated 6 weeks prior in the county legal offices. The proceeding had been filed by a petition. The petition had been signed by Lord Reginald Crane and countersigned by 2 county magistrates. Both of those magistrates were names Clara recognised from Edmund's dinner guest lists. She had served them coffee on 2 separate occasions. The petition stated that Edmund Harrow, Duke of Greywood, had been formally assessed by a licensed physician as suffering from a progressive degenerative condition affecting his mental faculties. The assessment concluded that he was no longer capable of managing his own estates or making sound legal decisions regarding their administration. The physician who had signed the assessment was named Dr. Aldred Poole. Clara had never heard of Dr. Aldred Poole. The proceeding, if it advanced through the remaining legal stages, would transfer the guardianship of the Greywood estate and all its financial holdings to the County Administrative Board. Lord Reginald Crane, as the representative of the petitioning party, would be appointed to oversee the transition period. Sylvia Crane, as the daughter of the overseeing representative, would within 1 season effectively control everything that Edmund Harrow had spent 14 years building. Clara read the letter a second time, slowly, making sure she had understood every line correctly. Then she folded it. She placed it exactly where she had found it. She returned to her chair. She sat down. She placed her hands flat on the desk in front of her, one on each side of the supply inventory, and she looked at the wall above the door and breathed in and breathed out, and did not allow herself to do anything else for the next 90 seconds. Not because she was frightened, though something adjacent to fear was present. Not because she was shocked, though the scale of it was larger than she had anticipated. She was thinking, and she needed her mind entirely clear. What happened over the following 3 weeks was the most careful and precise work Clara Ashford had ever done. More careful than any diagnosis, more precise than any treatment plan. Because this time, if she was wrong, there was no second chance. If she moved too quickly, or showed her hand before she had everything she needed, she would lose. And losing here did not just mean losing her position. It meant watching an innocent man be destroyed by a fabrication that he would not even see coming. She found Dr. Aldred Poole through the county medical registry. He was listed as a practicing physician in the Southern District, licensed 12 years ago. No marks on his record. She wrote him a letter, not under her own name, under her father's name, introducing herself as Dr. William Ashford's associate, conducting a study on assessment methodologies in the treatment of cognitive and neurological conditions. She asked a series of specific technical questions about his diagnostic approach, structured in a way that would seem routine to someone who did not know what she was looking for, and would be devastatingly revealing to someone who did. His reply arrived in 10 days. It was enthusiastic and lengthy and entirely confident in its own competence. It described the assessment criteria he used, the terminology he applied, the sequence of observations he followed in forming a clinical conclusion. Clara read it twice. Then she went to her father's medical library, which she had brought in its entirety in 2 crates when she first came to Greywood, and which occupied the shelves along the north wall of her workroom. She pulled 4 texts. She spent 2 evenings cross-referencing. What she found was this. The assessment criteria Dr. Poole described were not current practice. They were drawn from a methodology that had been in common use 15 years ago and had been formally discredited 9 years ago following a comprehensive review by the National Medical Association. The language he used, specific phrases, specific sequences of diagnostic logic, matched with an exactness that could not be coincidence, a paper that had been published 12 years ago in the County Medical Journal. A paper that was itself based on the discredited methodology, and that had been written, Clara discovered after another evening of research, pounds by a physician who had since had his licence revoked for issuing false assessments in a property dispute case in another county. Someone had given Dr. Poole a script, They had taken language from a discredited source, given it to a physician who did not have the depth of knowledge to recognize it, was discredited, and asked him to copy it into an official assessment. Dr. Poole, she was fairly certain, had done exactly that without understanding what he was participating in. She identified 4 phrases in his letter that could only have been derived from the original discredited paper, pounds, because each of those phrases contained a specific error of reasoning that was unique to the original source. You could not arrive at that error independently. You had to have copied it. She wrote all of this in the brown journal over the course of 5 evenings. She dated every entry. She cross-referenced every claim. She wrote a 7-page analysis comparing the assessment language, as described in Dr. Poole's letter, to the discredited paper, annotating each point of correspondence with the page number and paragraph from the original source. Then she took it to Mr. Holt. She arrived at his office on a Thursday morning before his first appointment. She placed the 7 pages on his desk and sat down and waited while he read them. He read slowly and carefully, and he did not say anything during the reading. When he finished, he set the pages down with a very deliberate movement, the movement of a man placing something carefully because he does not want to respond before he is certain of what he wants to say. Then he looked at Clara across the desk. He said that what she had was not evidence of a flawed assessment. He said what she had was evidence of a fabricated one. He said there was a difference, legally and practically, and that the difference was significant. He said that if she was willing to take this to the right magistrates, the ones who had not signed the petition, she had a case. He said it carefully and quietly, the way he said most important things. But underneath the careful quietness there was something Clara recognized from her father. The controlled anger of a decent man confronted with something indecent. She told him she would take it to the magistrates. She told him she needed 2 more weeks. He asked her what she needed the 2 weeks for. She said she needed to tell Edmund first. Mr. Holt looked at her for a moment. He asked whether that was wise. She said she did not know whether it was wise. She said it was necessary. She said a man had a right to know that his life was being dismantled around him before it was finished being dismantled. She said she was not in the habit of doing the right thing only when it was also convenient. Mr. Holt said nothing for a moment. Then he said he had known her father for 30 years and that she was very much his daughter. She thanked him and left. The conversation she had with Edmund that evening was the most difficult thing she had done in 2 years at Greywood Hall. Not because he was unkind. He was not unkind. He was very still and very controlled, and he listened to every word she said without interrupting, without flinching, without the kind of defensive reaction she had braced herself for. He listened the way that people listen when they understand, at some level, that what they are hearing is true, and are deciding whether to let that truth land or whether to deflect it. He let it land. She placed the legal letter on the desk between them. She placed her 7-page analysis beside it. She placed Mr. Holt's written summary on top. She walked him through it methodically, the way she would walk a patient through a diagnosis that required them to understand not just the conclusion, but the reasoning, so that when the time came to act, they would act from understanding rather than from fear. Edmund read for a long time. He read each document fully. He went back to the analysis twice and read sections of it again. Clara sat across from him and did not say anything additional and did not fidget. When he finally looked up, his face was the fate of a man who has just been shown something he cannot unsee. He asked her how long she had known. She said 3 weeks. He asked why she had not come to him immediately. She said because she had needed to be certain. Because she had not wanted to walk into that room carrying a fear with no foundation underneath it. She had wanted to carry a solution. Several seconds went by. The fire in the study grate made small sounds. Outside the window the grounds were dark and still. Edmund looked at the brown journal, which was open on the desk beside the analysis. He looked at the pages of her handwriting. The careful dated entries, the margin annotations, the references. He looked at the dates she had tracked, the methodical chronology of the 3 weeks she had spent doing this alone. He said her name. Just her name. Clara. Not Miss Ashford. Pounds. Which was how he usually addressed her. Just her name, the way you say a name when you have run out of every other language for what you are trying, Pounds, to express. He said he had not known. She said she knew that. He said he had been very blind about several things. She did not answer that. There was a line she had been holding carefully for 2 years, the line between what was professional and what was personal, and she was not going to step across it in a room full of evidence of betrayal. With the fire burning low, and both of them tired, and the air between them carrying more weight than either of them had named yet, it was not the right moment for anything fragile. She told him they needed to move quickly. She told him what she and Mr. Holt had agreed to do, and she laid out the steps clearly. He nodded. He agreed to every part of it without argument. The warmth in his eyes when he agreed, something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but was some combination of both that she did not have a clean word for, was something she wrote about in the brown journal that evening. At length, in the small hours of the morning when the house was quiet, and she was the only lamp still burning. 3 weeks after that conversation, on the night of Edmund's winter gathering, Clara found out what she had not known, the thing that changed the picture completely, and she found it not in a document this time. She found it by standing in a corridor at the wrong moment and hearing the wrong conversation, which is to say, the right one. She had gone upstairs during the party at 9:30. One of the elderly guests, a woman in her 70s named Mrs. Farley, had mentioned to Clara quietly near the drawing-room entrance that she was feeling some tightness in Pounds her chest. Clara had taken her to the small sitting-room near the staircase. Pounds had assessed her thoroughly, and established it was indigestion worsened by the heat of the room and the richness of the dinner, had given her something for the discomfort, and sent her to sit quietly for 20 minutes, Pounds, and then had gone upstairs to retrieve a specific preparation from the medical kit she kept in her workroom in case the discomfort recurred. She was coming back along the east corridor, the preparation in her hand, when she heard the voice through the door of Edmund's private sitting-room. The door was not fully closed. It had not latched properly. There was a gap of perhaps 2 inches, and through that gap came Lord Reginald Crane's voice, low and urgent and stripped of the social warmth it carried at dinner tables. Clara stopped. She did not choose to stop. She simply stopped. Pounds. The way you stop when you hear your own name said by someone who does not know you can hear them. Lord Crane was talking about the timeline, about the medical board, about ensuring that the remaining signatures were respected before the county magistrates had any opportunity to receive a counterclaim. He was saying the physician was secure. He was saying both magistrates were secure. He was saying the only remaining risk was the woman. He said her name. He said she had been asking questions, and that the questions had been specific enough to suggest she understood more than she should. Sylvia's voice, then, lower than her father's, but carrying the same stripped quality, the quality of a performance that has been set aside for a private conversation. She said that a medical assistant who raised inconvenient questions about a legal proceeding that implicated her own employer would simply be Pound dismissed. She said that once the position was terminated, that Clara would have no standing. That anything she said would be the account of a dismissed employee with cause for personal grievance, and that it would carry exactly the weight such an account deserved against the testimony of 2 county magistrates and a licensed physician. Lord Crane said good. Then Sylvia said it was already handled. She said Edmund had already signed the dismissal letter. Clara stood in the corridor outside that door, and she was very still. She stood there for the length of time it took to understand fully, not just the surface of it, but all of it, what she had just heard, what it meant, what it changed, what it did not change. Then she walked to the study. She went to Edmund's desk, 3rd drawer on the left. She had seen him use this drawer for documents that required his signature and had not yet been filed. She opened it. The dismissal letter was there. It was 2 pages. It cited conduct inconsistent with professional standards in formal, careful language that someone with legal training had written. It terminated her position at Greywood Hall with immediate effect. At the bottom, in Edmund's handwriting, was his signature. Clara looked at it for a long time. She looked at the signature. She looked at the date. She thought about the conversation she had had with Edmund 3 weeks ago, in this same room, and the warmth in his eyes, Pounds, and the way he had said her name. She thought about what her father had taught her about evidence. He had said, "Do not decide what the evidence means before you have all of it," he had said. "The story you construct from partial information is almost always wrong in at least one important detail," he had said. "Wait for the whole picture." She did not have the whole picture yet, but she had enough to move. She took the dismissal letter. She took the legal notice from the top of the stack on the desk. She went upstairs. She packed the brown journal and her father's instruments and a change of clothes. She put on her coat and her boots and picked up her bag. She walked downstairs through the kitchen, through the servants' entrance, out onto the gravel path. She walked past the rose beds and past the stone bench and past the old oak, and through the iron gate at the bottom of the grounds, which was unlocked because guests were still arriving. She walked to the road. She looked left and right in the fog, and she started walking toward Renwick. The road to Renwick was 4 miles of dark country lane. Clara walked it in the November fog with her bag in one hand, and both letters folded flat inside her coat, against her ribs, against her heartbeat. The cold was sharp enough to make her eyes sting. The fog swallowed everything more than 10 feet ahead of her, so that she was always walking toward a wall of grey that kept retreating. She had walked this road 100 times. She knew every bend of it. She had been walking for perhaps 40 minutes when she heard the cart behind her. She stepped to the verge without turning around. The horse's breath was visible in the lamplight, small clouds appearing and dissolving. The driver slowed without being asked. It was old Sutton. He had bought fever remedies from her father every autumn for as long as Clara could remember. He was 70 years old, and he had a face Winterfield, weathered and patient, and entirely without pretense. He looked down at her from the cart seat. He said, "You are carrying something heavy, miss." She said yes. He said, "Climb up then." She climbed up. He flicked the reins. The horse walked on. He did not ask where she was going. He did not ask why she was on the road alone at 10 o'clock at night in the November fog with a bag and a face like a woman who has made an irrevocable decision. He drove her to Renwick in the comfortable silence of a man who understood that some situations did not require commentary. She thanked him at the corner of his lane. He said it was nothing. He said her father had been a good man. He clicked at the horse and drove away. Clara went to Mr. Holt. He opened the door at 11 o'clock in his dressing gown with a candle, and his reading glasses still on, and he took one look at her face and stepped back without saying anything. She came in. She sat down at his kitchen table. He put the kettle on. He sat across from her. She laid both letters on the table between them. He read them. He read the dismissal letter first, which took a minute. Then he read the legal notice, which he had seen before but read again, fully. When he finished, he set both letters down and looked at the table for a moment, and then looked at Clara. He said the dismissal letter was a complication. He said it created the impression that Edmund had been aware of the plot and had moved to protect himself by eliminating the one person who might have disrupted it. He said that if that impression held, her credibility as the source of the counter-evidence would be significantly damaged. A dismissed employee, he said, has a motive for grievance. A motive for grievance creates the possibility of bias in the evidence. That possibility, Pounds in front of magistrates, who were already inclined toward the petitioning party, could be enough to discredit the analysis. Clara said she understood. She said she needed to know whether the dismissal was real. Mr. Holt looked at her carefully. She said she needed to know whether Edmund had understood what he was signing. She said it was possible. She considered it probable. Pounds that the letter had been placed among routine estate documents by Lord Crane's solicitor during one of the legal consultations that had been ongoing, pounds for several weeks, and that Edmund had signed it without reading it carefully, the way busy men signed routine documents. She said that if that was the case, the situation was different. She said that if he had knowingly dismissed her to protect the plot, the situation was also different, but different in the other direction. She said she could not proceed without knowing which version was true. Mr. Holt asked how she intended to find out. She said she would go back to Greywood in the morning. He asked if that was safe. She said she was not going through the front door. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Through Mr. Peel." She said, "Through Mr. Peel." He poured the tea. He said she could have the spare room. He said they would talk further in the morning. She took the spare room. She did not sleep very much. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought through every variable she could identify, the way she thought through a difficult diagnosis, examining each piece of information from every angle, testing it against what she knew, checking her own conclusions for the places where she might be wrong, because she wanted to be right. By 5 in the morning she was fairly sure she knew the answer. By 6 she had written Mr. Peel a note. By 7 she was standing at the garden gate. Mr. Peel opened the gate at 7:05 with the unhurried ease of a man who has been expecting you. He had received the note at 6, delivered by old Sutton's nephew, who was 11 years old and extremely fast on a bicycle, and who had, when Mr. Wynne. Peel opened his cottage door to find him standing there in the early light, simply handed over the note without explanation and ridden away. Mr. Peel read the note once. Then he put on his coat and his garden boots and went to open the gate. He walked Clara through the kitchen garden to the servants' entrance without speaking. At the kitchen door, he stopped and looked at her for a moment with the direct assessing look of a man who has watched 40 years of things happen in. "Pounds a place and knows what matters," he said. "Mrs. Graves is already up." He said it and then walked back toward the rose beds. Mrs. Graves was at the kitchen table with a pot of tea already made and 2 cups already placed. She looked at Clara when she came in, and she did not look surprised. She poured the tea. She sat down. Clara sat down across from her missus. Graves had been at Greywood Hall for 22 years. She had served under 4 dukes and 3 estate physicians, and 1 very difficult housekeeper before her, who had eventually left under circumstances that Mrs. Graves described on the one occasion Clara had asked, only as circumstances. She had a face that gave very little away, and a memory that gave away even less. She had watched Clara work for 2 years, with the careful attention of someone who was reserving her judgment until she had sufficient information, and then had made her judgment and not revised it. She told Clara what had happened after she left. She said Edmund had come to the study at 10:30, between the dancing and the late supper. She said he had gone directly to the desk. She said the footman, who had been sent to bring the late brandy, had seen him through the open door, standing at the open 3rd drawer, Pounds looking at the empty space where the documents had been, and that the footman had been so unnerved by the expression on the Duke's face that he had retreated without delivering the brandy, and had gone immediately to Mrs. Graves. Edmund had then gone back downstairs to the gathering. Mrs. Graves said his face was not the face he wore at parties. She said it was not a face she had seen on him before, which meant something, given that she had seen him at some difficult moments over 22 years. He had walked to where Sylvia was standing near the fireplace, and he had asked her, in a voice that Mrs. Graves had heard from the doorway, and that she described as perfectly level, where Clara was. Sylvia had said that Clara had chosen to leave. Edmund had said that was not an answer to the question he had asked. Mrs. Graves said the room had gone very quiet at that point. The particular quality of quiet that happens in a room full of people when something real breaks through the surface of the social occasion. Sylvia had said, still in her social voice, but with something strained underneath it now. That Clara had found certain documents and had misinterpreted them and left, and that it was really for the best given the circumstances. Edmund had turned then, and looked at Lord Crane, who was standing nearby with a glass of wine. Mrs. Graves said what happened next was not a loud thing. She said Edmund Harrow had never needed volume. He had asked Lord Crane 2 questions. The first was whether the legal proceeding was real, meaning active and advanced, and not merely a precautionary filing. Lord Crane said it was a precautionary measure. Edmund asked whether the dismissal letter that had apparently been signed and placed in his third drawer had been prepared by Lord Crane's solicitor and introduced into the estate documents without his specific knowledge. Lord Crane did not answer. Mrs. Graves said Edmund had looked at that silence for exactly 3 seconds. Then he had turned to the room at large and in the same level voice had asked every guest to leave. He had said it once. They had left. At midnight, when the house was empty and Mrs. Graves was overseeing the clearing of the ballroom, Edmund had come to find her. He had given her a sealed letter. He had asked her to ensure it reached Clara Ashford. He had not asked where Clara was. He had said only that he trusted Mrs. Graves would find a way, and that the letter was urgent. Mrs. Graves slid the letter across the kitchen table. Clara looked at it. She looked at her own name written on the front of it in Edmund's handwriting. She picked it up. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages in Edmund's handwriting, and Edmund's handwriting was not small. It was the handwriting of a man who wrote as he spoke, with precision and without ornamentation, every word placed where it was supposed to be. He wrote that he was not going to ask her to forgive him before she had the full account. He wrote that the dismissal letter had been placed among estate correspondence by Lord Crane's solicitor at a legal consultation 3 weeks prior, during which he had signed 11 other documents relating to the water rights arrangements and the boundary survey and the quarterly financial review. He wrote that he had not read it. He wrote that this was not an excuse and he was not presenting it as one. He wrote that a man who signs documents without reading them is a man who deserves whatever arrives in the unread pages. He wrote that he had known about the legal proceeding from its early stages, that he had been told by Lord Crane that it was a protective legal instrument, a formality filed to safeguard the estate's administrative continuity in the event of incapacity, and that it required no further action on his part. He wrote that he had believed this because he had wanted to believe it, because Lord Crane had been his father's financial associate, and he had inherited the relationship along with the estate and had not examined it with the honesty it deserved. He wrote that this was a failure of judgment that he owned entirely. He wrote that it had cost him the one person at Greywood who had, without being asked, without being acknowledged, and without any requirement for reward, been doing the most important work in the house. He wrote that he had spent 6 years since Thomas died building things, land, alliances, influence. He wrote that he had believed this was what safety looked like. He wrote that he understood now that he had been wrong. He wrote that safety was not a thing built from the outside in. He had been looking in the entirely wrong direction for 6 years and had not known it until a woman who mapped illness patterns on a wall chart and sat with elderly groundskeepers on stone benches and went to see Mr. Holt at 11 o'clock at night, with evidence she had built alone over 3 weeks, had walked out of his house into the fog. He wrote that he would not ask her to return. He wrote that he would support her fully in whatever she and Mr. Holt chose to do, pounds in any form that support needed to take. He wrote that he would appear before any magistrate, sign any document, say publicly whatever was true and useful, and that he asked nothing in exchange. Then he wrote one final paragraph. He wrote, "I would have found a way to keep you here, even if it had cost me every legal arrangement and social alliance I had spent 14 years building, had I understood sooner what it was I was allowing to walk out of this house. I understand it fully now. I am aware that the time for that understanding to be useful to you has passed. I am not writing this because I expect it to change anything. I am writing it because you spent 3 weeks protecting me without telling me, and I could not let you go without telling you that I know exactly what that cost you, and that I will not forget it. Clara read the letter 3 times. She sat at Mr. Holt's kitchen table in the morning light, and she read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat. She finished her tea. She looked at Mrs. Graves. She said, "Tell me what time he rises in the morning." Mrs. Graves looked at her for a moment. The corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. She said, 7:30. "He takes his coffee in the study." Clara nodded. She said she would be back the day after tomorrow. She had one more thing to do first. The county magistrate hearing took place 11 days later in the chambers of the Eastern District Court, in a long room with high windows and wooden benches that smelled of old paper and wool. It was not a public event. Legal proceedings of this kind were not public until they needed to be, and both sides had reason to prefer it remained private. But the people who mattered were there, the 3 senior magistrates who had not signed the petition. Mr. Holt, serving as Clara's legal representative, with a 7-page analysis and 3 supporting documents in a folder on the table. 2 witnesses from the county medical registry who had reviewed the analysis and provided written assessments of their own. Edmund to Clara's left, in a plain dark coat with no medals and no performance whatsoever, just a man who had shown up. Lord Crane arrived with his own solicitor, a man named Pemberton, who had a reputation for finding angles in places where there were no angles. Sylvia was not present. Clara presented the analysis. She stood at the table and spoke for 40 minutes without notes, because she had written the analysis herself and had no need of notes. She was precise, she was clear. She was entirely calm in the way of someone who has nothing to defend because everything she is saying is true and she knows it and she has documented it, and it is in the folder on the table for anyone who wishes to check it. She did not editorialize. She did not make it personal. She presented the evidence the way her father had taught her to present a diagnosis. Lead with what you can prove, support it with your documentation, and trust the facts to do the work that feelings cannot. Dr. Poole was questioned for 11 minutes. He could not explain the specific terminology in his own assessment. He said he had been provided with reference materials by the instructing party. He said he had believed the materials to be current and accurate. He said he had relied on them in good faith. One of the senior magistrates asked him who the instructing party was. Dr. Poole said Lord Reginald Crane. There was a silence in the room that had a specific quality to it. Lord Crane's solicitor Pemberton raised the dismissal letter. He said that the primary source of the counter-evidence was a woman who had been formally dismissed from her position on grounds of professional misconduct, and that such a source had an obvious material interest in discrediting a legal proceeding. Edmund spoke. He said dismissal letter had been placed in a stack of estate correspondence by Lord Crane's legal team during a consultation 3 weeks prior, and that he had signed it as part of a batch of 11 documents without reading it individually. He said he was formally withdrawing it as of this date and would provide the court with a signed statement to that effect. He said the statement was already prepared and he placed it on the table. He said it in the same level voice that required no volume. He said it with the clarity of a man who has decided that performing certainty is an inferior substitute for actually having it. Pemberton said the Duke's account was convenient. Edmund looked at him for a moment. He said Pemberton was welcome to characterise it however he found useful. He said the documents were what they were. The room was very quiet. The senior magistrate looked at Clara and asked whether she wished to add anything before they moved to deliberation. Clara said yes. She stood up. She said, "I arrived at Greywood Hall 2 years ago to do a job. I did that job to the best of my ability every day. When I found evidence that a man I worked for was being harmed by a fabrication, pounds, I spent 3 weeks documenting that evidence carefully and brought it to a legal representative, because that was the correct thing to do. I am standing in this room today because a woman doing her job correctly has apparently become something that requires defending. I would like the court to consider that before it deliberates. She sat down. The room was very quiet for a long moment. Then the senior magistrate called a recess. When the chamber reconvened, the petition was dismissed. The proceeding was formally closed and removed from the county registry, with a notation regarding the conduct of the petitioning party. Dr. Poole's licence was referred to the medical board for a formal review. Lord Crane's notation was entered as a matter of public record. Lord Crane stood when the decision was read. He began to speak. The senior magistrate looked at him over his glasses and said with great politeness and absolute finality that the matter was closed and that the court thanked everyone for their time. Lord Crane left. He left in the manner of a man who intends to find another angle, and has not yet accepted that there are none. Clara stood in the corridor outside the chamber afterward with Mr. Holt. Pounds, who was putting his papers back into his case with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms like this one and still finds it's satisfying when things go correctly. She heard footsteps. She turned. Edmund was standing a few feet away. He was not arranged in any particular way. He was not performing anything. He looked tired in the specific way of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just set it down, and is experiencing the strange lightness that follows and is not quite sure what to do with his hands. He said her name. She said, yes. He said, thank you is not adequate. She said, I know. He said he was aware that the way the dismissal had been handled had made everything harder for her than it needed to be. She said it had. He said he was sorry for that. He said it simply, without preamble, without elaborate justification. She said, I know you are. He looked at her for a moment. His expression was very open, which was not something she had seen on him before. Edmund Harrow's face was usually a managed thing. This was not that. He asked very quietly whether she would consider coming back to Greywood. Not as an employee. He said those words clearly, and he let them sit in the air between them without trying to qualify them. Clara looked at him. She thought about the portrait at the end of the West Wing corridor. She thought about the chart on the wall. She thought about Mr. Peel on the stone bench, and the brown journal, and the fog on the road to Renwick, and old Sutton's cart, and the 3 letters in her coat pocket. She thought about 2 years of watching a man from the periphery of his own life, and seeing, every time she looked carefully enough, the person underneath the performance. She said, not yet. She said she needed some time. He nodded. He accepted it entirely. He did not ask for a timeline. He did not ask what conditions were attached. He simply accepted it, the way a person accepts something when they understand that the acceptance itself is the point. She turned and walked down the corridor with Mr. Holt. She thought, as she walked, that a man who accepts what is offered without reaching for more than he has been given is a man who has learned something important. She was not sure yet whether it would last, but it was a beginning, and beginnings were what you worked with. The winter passed and the county settled back into itself. Lord Crane withdrew his county engagements with the careful, gradual quiet of a man who understands he has been defeated and prefers not to require anyone to say it to his face. The social circle that had formed around him and Sylvia redistributed itself toward other centres of gravity, as social circles always do when the gravity of a particular arrangement has been removed. Sylvia left. She went south to a cousin's household in a county where the events of the autumn were not yet common knowledge, and where her particular skills would find a new application. Clara did not wish her poorly. She simply did not think about her very often. Dr. Poole's case went before the medical board in January. The board reviewed Clara's analysis and the supporting assessments from the registry witnesses. His licence was suspended for 22 months pending a full review of his practice record. He appealed. The appeal was heard. The suspension was upheld. Mr. Peel's health continued to improve through the winter and into the spring. His breathing was easier than it had been in 2 years. He tended the rose beds through the cold months with a patience that Clara had always admired, cutting back the dead growth carefully and leaving the canes at exactly the right length for the following season. He told anyone who would listen that the treatment he had received was the best thing that had happened to his chest since 1887. Clara spent 3 months in Renwick. She reopened her father's practice on a part-time basis, 2 days a week to start, because the village had been without a regular physician since the county board absorbed the practice, and people had been managing without and doing so less well than they needed to. Edmund wrote to her in November, 3 weeks after the hearing. The letter did not ask her to come back. It described the estate, the school that he was planning to build on the eastern edge of the grounds for the children of the estate workers. Something he said he had been thinking about for years and had not done. The new agreements he was building with county officials, whom he had chosen this time with considerably more care than he had applied to the previous set. The way the grounds looked in the early winter, the rose beds cut back, the oak losing its last leaves. He wrote 3 paragraphs about Mr. Peel, who had apparently taken it upon himself to supervise the replanting of the kitchen garden wall beds, and was conducting this project with an authority that Edmund describes as impressive, and that Clara understood meant Mr. Peel was enjoying himself enormously. The letter was not a love letter. It was a description of a place and the people in it, written by a man who wanted someone to know what the place was like now, and trusted that she would understand why he was telling her. She wrote back. She described Renwick. She described the practice and the patients and the village in the early winter. She described her father's journals, pounds, which she had been reading in the evenings, finding in them a record of 31 years of work that she had been part of and had not fully understood the scale of until she saw it laid out chronologically. He wrote again in December. This letter was shorter. It described a morning he had spent at Thomas's grave on the anniversary of his death. He wrote that he had stood there for a long time and had thought about several things. He wrote that he had thought about the difference between managing grief and carrying it properly, and that he had spent 6 years doing the former, which looked like strength and was actually something closer to avoidance. He wrote that he had begun to understand what carrying it properly looked like. He said it was slower and harder and considerably less clean than management, but that it had a quality to it that management had never had. Something that felt, in the quiet of the graveyard in the December morning, like it might eventually become actual peace rather than the performance of having moved on. He did not say that this had anything to do with Clara. He did not need to. She read that letter 4 times. Then she folded it and placed it with the others in the inside pocket of her winter coat. Then she started packing. She arrived at Greywood on a Thursday morning in April, when the grounds were bright with early spring and the rose beds pounds were covered in new leaf, and the kitchen garden smelled of turned earth, and everything had the quality of a place waking up from something long and dark into something it was not quite sure of yet. Edmund met her at the entrance, not arranged, not performing. He was wearing his working coat and had clearly come from the grounds. There was earth on the left knee of his trousers, and he had the particular stillness that Clara had spent 2 years learning to distinguish from his other stillnesses. This was not the stillness of control. This was the stillness of a man who is very aware of where he is and who he is looking at and has no interest in pretending otherwise. They walked through the house. They talked for 3 hours. About the estate, the plans for the school, the water rights arrangements which had been renegotiated with a different set of county partners, the medical quarters which Edmund had quietly and substantially expanded during the winter. He showed her the expansion in the afternoon. She walked through it slowly. The new shelving was the right kind, deep enough for the heavy reference texts, spaced correctly for the bottles and the equipment. The floor had been properly levelled, which the old quarters had never been. There was a new examination table and a second desk along the north wall for case notes. She looked at the window. It was a large window. It faced the garden. In the afternoon light of April, it threw a warm rectangle across the floor and up the near wall. It was exactly the right window for a room where you needed good light for detailed work. She said, "This is very well done." Edmund was standing in the doorway with his hands in the pockets of his working coat. He said he had consulted Mr. Peel about the window. She looked at him. He said Mr. Peel had been very clear that it should face the garden and not the road. He said Mr. Peel had apparently strong opinions about windows. She looked back at the light on the floor. She said, "I will stay." He said he was very glad. He said it simply, without embellishment. Several moments passed in the quiet of the new room, with the spring light coming through the correct window. She said there would need to be clarity about what staying meant. He said he understood. He said he had thought about it at length. He said what he was asking her to stay as was not the position she had held before, pounds, which he said had always been an inadequate framing for what she had actually been doing, and for what he was hoping, if she was willing, they might become to each other. He said the last part with the slight roughness of a man who has rehearsed something, and then at the final moment abandoned the rehearsed version because the real version is the only one that matters. Clara stood in the light of the correct window and looked at the garden and thought about all of it, about the 2 years before, about the fog and the road and Mr. Holt's kitchen table, about the brown journal in her bag and the letters in her coat pocket and the rose beds. Outside, and Mr. Peel somewhere on the grounds with his strong opinions about windows. About the man standing in the doorway with earth on his trouser knee, and 3 pages of honest handwriting in a letter she had read 4 times. She said, "I am willing." They were married in June. In the small stone chapel at the edge of Renwick Village Green, which had been Clara's father's chapel for 31 years, and which had a window behind the altar that threw the morning light down the aisle in pounds, the particular way of old chapel windows, warm and slightly golden, the kind of light that makes a room feel like it has been waiting for something. There were 22 people. Mr. Holt, who cried briefly and with great dignity during the vows, and afterward denied it entirely to anyone who mentioned it. Mrs. Graves, who wore a grey dress that Clara noticed was newer than her usual ones, and who stood very straight throughout and looked satisfied in the deep private way of someone who has watched something go wrong for a long time and is now watching it go correctly. Mr. Peel, in his good coat, who cried openly and without any concern whatsoever about anyone's opinion of this, pounds, and who had brought roses from the greywood beds, and placed them in every available vessel in the chapel the evening before, so that the whole room smelled of June and earth. Old Sutton came in the farm cart because it was what he had, and nobody said a word about it. He parked it at the gate and came in and sat in the 3rd pew, and when Edmund passed him before the ceremony and thanked him for coming, old Sutton said he had delivered Miss Ashford on a foggy November night, when she was carrying something too heavy to carry alone, and he reckoned he was entitled to see where she ended up. Edmund stood at the altar in a plain dark coat, no medals. He was still in the way, he was always still, but this was not his controlled stillness. This was the stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was looking for, and is standing in it very carefully, because he does not want to disturb whatever has made it possible. Clara came down the aisle. She was wearing a dress the colour of winter sky, a blue that was not bright but was not grey either, something in between that was exactly the colour of the light, before a day decides what kind of day it will be. In the deep pocket of the dress she had the brown journal almost full by now, its green cover worn at the corners. Not because she planned to write in it, because it had been with her through everything and it belonged in this room. She stood beside Edmund. He looked at her in the way he had learned, slowly and with difficulty, and with her patience as the instrument, to look at things he valued, directly, without hiding. She looked back at him the same way. The morning light came through the old chapel window. That was enough. In the years that followed, Greywood Hall became something different from what it had been. Not dramatically different. Not in any way that announced itself. But the difference was real, and it was visible to anyone who had known the place before. The school opened on the eastern edge of the grounds in September of the following year. 47 students on the first day, and a waiting list of 31 more. Edmund had designed the building himself, in consultation with Clara and with Mr. Peel, who had opinions about everything, including south-facing classroom windows and the importance of a covered outdoor area for rain days. The covered area was built. Clara's medical practice expanded to serve not only the estate but 3 surrounding villages by the second year after the wedding. She had trained 2 additional physicians, both women who had experience and no paperwork, pounds in the same situation she had been in 4 years ago, recommended through Mr. Holt. The wall of her consultation room was covered in charts, the seasonal patterns, the prevention maps, the illness histories of 640 patients arranged by region and age group and recurring Pound's condition. The 2 new physicians consulted the charts every morning. They had added their own sections in the margin spaces Clara had always left, deliberately for exactly this purpose. Edmund did not become a soft man. He was still controlled and precise and capable of clearing a room with 2 sentences when the situation required. But the grief that had lived inside him for 9 years had finally found its way out. Not all at once and not with any ceremony, but in the slow, gradual way that things move when they finally have somewhere to go. Into the school. Into the Sunday mornings, in the rose beds with Clara and Mr. Peel, who complained about the weather every single week with great happiness and no intention of stopping. Into the way Edmund listened now, which was different from before, more present, less defended. The way a person listens when they have stopped using attention as a form of control and started using it as a form of care. On a December evening 5 years after the wedding, Clara sat at the desk in her consultation room, with the lamp burning low in the grounds outside, the window quiet under the first snow of the season. The brown journal was open in front of her. It had been full for 3 years, and she had started a second one, also green-covered, also worn at the corners by now. She was writing about the day, about a difficult case she had managed in the morning, a child with a fever that had given her a bad hour before responding to treatment, about the new term starting at the school, which now had 93 students and a second building under construction, about a letter from the county medical board offering her a permanent position on their oversight panel, which she had decided to accept. She wrote about the snow outside the window, about the quiet of the house, which was a different quiet from the one she had known in the first 2 years, when she had moved through Greywood as an almost invisible presence, and the silence had felt like something she was required to maintain. This quiet was the quiet of a house that contained people who understood each other, the quiet of something that had been built from the inside out and was resting for the moment in its own solidity. She closed the journal. She put down the pen. She looked at the window. Outside in the garden, in the snow, the rose beds were cut back for winter. The oak at the end of the path was bare. The lamp-post at the gate threw a small circle of light into the dark. She thought about a foggy November night and a gravel path and a gate and a road and a cart driven by a man who did not ask questions. She thought about how far the road had gone. 2 years after that evening, Clara gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margaret. Margaret grew up at Greywood Hall, between the rose beds and the consultation room, and the school on the eastern grounds, and a father who was teaching himself, late and imperfectly but genuinely, to listen before he spoke. She grew up in a house where work was done honestly, and the credit for it was given to the person who had done it, where quiet people were not assumed to have nothing to say, where a woman with ink-stained hands and a green-covered journal was not a background figure, but the reason the whole place worked the way it did. When Margaret was old enough to understand the story of her parents, she asked her mother about it once. It was an evening in autumn. They were in the consultation room, together, Clara at the desk and Margaret in the chair by the window that had always been the right window, the one facing the garden. Margaret was 12. She was working through one of her father's old county maps, which she had discovered in the study and found interesting. She looked up from the map and asked her mother what had made her decide to stay. After everything, she said, after all of it. Clara looked at the question for a moment. She looked at the lamp on the desk and the garden through the window and the second green journal open in front of her. She said, "I stayed because I believed the truth was worth the cost of standing for it. And because there are some things, once you have seen them clearly, that you cannot unsee. And some people, once you understand them honestly, that you cannot walk away from, not because you owe them something, because they have become part of what you know about yourself." Margaret looked at her mother for a long moment with the particular focused look she had inherited directly from her father. Then she went back to the map, and Margaret Harrow, when she was old enough to tell the story herself, whenever anyone asked her about her mother, would say this: "My mother walked out of Greywood Hall on a November night with nothing but the truth in her coat pocket and the fog in front of her. And every person who had ever dismissed her as background, as the quiet one who would not cause trouble, had made the same mistake. They had looked at her and seen someone who would absorb whatever was done to her and remain in place. What she actually was someone who was paying close attention, who was building the picture, who was waiting for the moment when she had everything she needed. She had everything she needed that night, and what she did with it changed everything. If you stayed until the very last word of this story, then you already understand the thing that took Edmund Harrow 2 full years to understand. The person doing the quiet work, the careful work, the work that holds everything together while the room is looking in another direction, is never without power. They are simply choosing when to use it. Clara never raised her voice. She never made a scene. She did not confront, did not accuse, did not perform her own pain for an audience. She simply paid attention. She built the evidence. She walked out into the fog when the moment required it, and in walking out she changed everything. This is what this channel is for. The stories that live underneath the loud ones. The women who worked in the dark without credit. The reckonings that arrive not with noise but with a green-covered journal, a 7-page analysis, and the kind of courage that does not announce itself but does not stop either. If this story moved something in you, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell so you are there for every story we tell. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from, and whether you have ever been the quiet one in the room who saw everything. Your voice belongs here, and every single comment is read. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that patience and truth, together, are the most powerful combination in the world. We are just getting started.